Thank you so much, Leon. Good evening, everyone. I want to start by, of course, saying thank you to Leon and Cedar Crest College for this opportunity to speak and share my knowledge during this year's Black History Month. I would also like to just acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Lenape Nation through a very brief moment of silence. Thank you. So let's get started. Again, my name is Candace, or ACE for short. I use they, them pronouns, and my social identity is Afro Native, non binary, organizer, educator, student, millennial, sexologist, coach, yogi, and Buddhist. I like to start my presentations off by giving a few of my social identities for the audience to reference. Our social identities are what influence how we see the world and what beliefs or values we may take on as a result of that perspective. I encourage you all to self reflect on what your social identities are and how those identities have influenced your lived experiences. These social identities allow us to be a part of a group and gain a sense of belonging in that group's social world. And with these identities, they play an important role in shaping our self image. The more we identify with a particular group, the more that group plays a role in shaping how we feel about ourselves. So I want to start by thanking everyone on this call, of course, and those who are going to be watching the recording and made space in their calendars to be able to attend tonight's presentation. Tonight, I invite you all to join me in an exploration of the intersectionality of race and gender as it pertains to Black queer resistance, with a specific focus on femininity and queerness. We will examine Black queer history from the past, the present, and a hopeful future. And because this presentation is open to a very wide audience of learners, I wanted to start by beginning to explore through some intentional vocabulary. So, generation by generation, the pronunciations that we use evolve, new words are borrowed or invented, the meaning of old words has shifted, and terminology has been developed or decayed. Language essentially contributes to human evolution by creating new ways of communicating thoughts and ideas, self expression, and complex social architectures. Languages also give us the ability to create these new structures, to create new technology and new social systems. As we evolve as a human species, so should the language we use. One of my many mentors, Miss Camilla Green, she's a local advocate in the area of the Lehigh Valley, once told me that the language we use today should not be the same language we used in the 1960s. However, one must be willing to self reflect and acknowledge the ways in which our own vernacular have conditioned us to experience the world in and around ourselves. Through my personal expedition, I have learned that if something does not grow, it decays. Questioning and challenging the history, the language, and the people who have historically dictated both have played major roles in my own personal journey of resistance. My only goal for tonight is to share parts of this liberation with you all in hopes that it will spark curiosity for you to unlearn and relearn new and different information. So I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my presentation on the screen. It's going to condense me into a little small box here. So we're going to shift over in just 1 second and 5, 2, there we go. Perfect. So I want to begin with the term intersectionality. In the 1989, this word was coined by scholar and theorist Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a civil rights writer, a critical race theorist, as well as a Black feminist legal theorist. Intersectionality explains how discrimination and oppression compound based on one's individual experiences related to their gender identity, their race, nationality, ethnicity, social class, sexual orientation, physical ability, body size, religion, and other identity markers. It addresses how identities are embedded within interlocking systems of power, such as racism and sexism, that can lead to very complex experiences of prejudice and discrimination, as well as aggravated disadvantages. A quote from Kimberly states that intersectionality is essentially a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti racism or feminism or other social just advocacy structures that we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain types of problems. Tonight's presentation will focus on the intersectionality of race and gender, specifically Black femininity and Black queerness. As noted earlier, it is extremely important for us to understand what these terms mean before we can even begin to understand how they interact with one another. So when we refer to race, this is considered the controversial classification system used to categorize humans on the basis of hereditary physical traits or social qualities. Race is a social construct made up to point out differences among us. It is not genetic. Biologically, race does not exist among humans. There is only one race, the human race. In fact, anthropologists have rejected this belief system of race since the 1950s, when the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization issued a statement asserting that all humans belong to the same species and that race is not a biological reality, but a myth. Alternatively, we are all different ethnicities and nationalities. When we talk about gender, this is referring to the socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities of girls, women, boys, men, and gender diverse people. A person's sex is biologically defined. However, their gender is a social construct. Therefore, gender is also not genetic. I would be remiss if I did not also point out the difference between gender and sexual orientation, as they are oftentimes used simultaneously, although they do mean very completely different things. So when we talk about sexual orientation, this describes a person who is attracted to or wants to have a romantic or platonic relationship with someone. Sexual orientation includes things like being gay, lesbian, straight, bisexual, asexual, pretty much all the letters of the LGBTQ. A person who identifies as non binary, like myself, can be straight, they can be gay, they can be bisexual, or even asexual, meaning that they have no sexual attraction to anyone. When we talk about these terms, we also need to address this term queer or queerness. This is oftentimes used as an umbrella term to describe someone who is strange or odd or weird based on established societal standards or heterosexual norms of gender and sexuality. This term has evolved over the years as it was once used as a derogatory term and has since been reclaimed by the LGBTQ community as a catch-all for all LGBTQ individuals. In 2021, some data from the Gallup Daily Tracking Poll estimated that about 40% of LGBTQ adults in the United States are actually people of color, and about 12% of that number identify as Black. That's roughly 1.2 million adults in the US who identify as both Black and LGBTQ. Both demographics have historically dealt with unjust discrimination, oppression, systemic disparities that span from physical violence, workplace discrimination, housing discrimination, police brutality, and a lack of adequate access to mental and physical health care. Now, I want us to begin to explore this by taking a look at the past and how that past has actually influenced our present and how it will continue to influence our future. I want to start with Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who was a distinguished Black author, educator, editor, publisher, historian, and most recognized for his role in establishing Negro History Week, which initially was the second week of February to coincide with the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, which later expanded into what we now know as Black History Month. He became the second Black American after W.E. Du Bois to obtain his PhD from Harvard University and later joined the faculty of Howard University. Woodson recognized the contributions of African Americans being overlooked and ignored and deliberately suppressed by white writers of history textbooks and the teachers who used them. Dr. Woodson founded the Association for the Study of African American Life and History to establish this tradition of showcasing the contributions of Black Americans and to preserve true American history. Through this association, he also recognized the importance of providing a theme to focus the attention of the public. And therefore, each year since 1928, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History has selected an annual theme for this celebration. This year's theme is Black Resistance, how Black Americans have fought against racial inequality. Black resistance is the exploration of the African American legacy to resist oppression in all its forms through politics, arts, society, education, and even internalized white supremacy. At the end of my presentation, I definitely encourage everyone on this call to expand their knowledge from not just United States Black history, but to begin to learn the histories of Black Americans across the Americas, looking at Black history in Canada as well as Black history in Mexico, and seeing how these are all interconnected through our histories and through our bloodlines. When we speak of Black resistance, we also speak of Black oppression. For the purpose of my presentation, I will focus on two systems of oppression which have influenced Black and queer individuals the most, those being white supremacy culture or racism and patriarchy or sexism. We have all been conditioned into a society that is both patriotic and white supremacist by nature. This country has a very long lasting legacy of exploiting Black and Brown bodies, disregarding women, and negating queer individuals through intergenerational trauma caused by these systems of oppression. And although we don't have enough time to dive into the elements of these systems of oppression, I will share my contact information at the end of the slides for anybody who wants to reach out to learn a little bit more. So the first system of oppression that we're going to touch on today is white supremacy culture, which can be described as a form of racism centered around the belief that white people are superior to people of other racial backgrounds, and that whites should politically, economically, and socially dominate non-whites. This also describes a political ideology and systemic oppression that perpetuates and maintains the social, political, historical, and even industrial white domination. This comprehensive definition comes from the National Education Association. So when we talk about white supremacy or racism, It is typically broken down into about 15 elements or characteristics, which you can see displayed on your screen here. Each of these elements operate to suppress people of color in both systemic situation and structures, as well as interpersonal situations. Again, we don't have enough time to really dive too deep into the elements of white supremacy culture, but I do urge you, if you can, take a screenshot of the slide. I can also send you a list of these characteristics to learn a little bit more, and so that you can also learn to point these out in your daily life as well. The second structure of oppression that we're going to talk about is patriarchy, which is classified as a social or political system that empowers men while largely excluding and disempowering women in both public and private spheres. Now, this is just a very general definition that I pulled from a very quick Google search, which gives us a good starting point, but it's not quite the full picture. To analyze this system further, we actually need to address the term sexism, which is typically defined as a prejudice, a stereotype, or discrimination, typically against women on the basis of sex. Sexism also affects queer individuals and those of all genders and sexualities. In this context, sexism is the undermining and devaluing of femininity, as well as discrimination against femininity. Instead of it being narrowed down to a prejudice and discrimination against cisgendered women from cisgendered men, sexism plays into homophobia, transphobia, gender and sex-based discrimination, as well as misogyny, which can be defined as a hatred of women or anyone who is perceived to be like a woman. When we are working on understanding these systems of oppression, we can then begin to conceptualize how they actually compound on one another through intersectionality. For example, a Black transsexual woman must navigate the oppressive structures of white supremacy culture, sexism, and transphobia. Meanwhile, a white gay man will likely only need to navigate the oppressions of homophobia while holding on to his white male privileges. To understand these intersectionalities better, I want to guide us on a very brief historical timeline that illuminates Black, queer, and feminist movements. This timeline does not include every important person or event. However, it encompasses many relevant historical events by also highlighting Black women and Black queer individuals who embodied this principle of resistance. By seeing this record of history presented together, we are able to see how movements have influenced and shaped one another. So, with our timeline, I felt it would be appropriate for us to start at the beginning of Black Americans being notated in American history. And that was in 1619, where the first documented Africans arrived to Jamestown to be enslaved. Now, fast forward to 1808 is when Congress actually bans the import of Africans from Africa. I also want to make a notation that a year prior to this, in 1807, King George II actually signed the law, the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade, banning slavery in the British Empire. That was in 1807. Moving forward into 1848, we see the Seneca Falls Convention, which was the first women's rights convention in the United States. However, it did not include women of color. This is considered the first wave of the feminism movement. And then when we look at 1851, we see Sojourner Truth, an African American abolitionist, women's rights advocate who delivered a speech titled Ain't I a Woman at the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, where she spoke of equal rights for Black women. And on the screen, I placed a quote from this particular presentation that she gave, in which she talked about how women are typically catered to, but her as a Black woman have not been considered a woman who would need to be catered to in the same manner. Ain't I a woman? A few years after this, in 1861, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by President Lincoln in the midst of the Civil War. However, this proclamation only applied to enslaved people in states that were in rebellion during that year. This included South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Arkansas, and North Carolina. Slavery was not actually abolished by the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, 2 years later, in 1865, the 13th Amendment was ratified to actually abolish and prohibit slavery, except as a punishment for a crime that a person has duly been convicted for, which is still present to today. Also in 1865 was the same year that the KKK was formed. This year also marks the first celebration of Juneteenth for Black Americans as their true Independence Day. Now, in 1868, the 14th Amendment was ratified, granting citizenship to all enslaved individuals. And then in 1870, 2 years later, the 15th Amendment was ratified, granting Black men the right to vote. When we look at 1896, I'm going to move myself around here. Sorry about that, y'all. When we look at 1896, we see Plessy versus Ferguson. This was the court ruling that racial segregation laws did not violate the United States Constitution as long as the facilities for each race were equal in quality. This is a doctrine that came to be known as separate but equal. And then a few years after that, in 1919, we see the NAACP being formulated. Oftentimes, when individuals refer to the NAACP, they do not mention Ida B. Wells, who was an investigative journalist, educator, abolitionist, and Black women's suffrage advocate. She was also one of the founding members of the NAACP. And this is a photo of her on her autobiography, the cover of her autobiography. Now, in 1913, we see the first women's suffrage parade in Washington, which was organized by the National American Women's Suffrage Association. A few years after that, in 1920, we see the 19th Amendment, which was ratified, granting white women the right to vote. This was 70 years after Seneca Falls and 50 years after Black men were granted the right to vote. However, voting taxes and literacy texts in the urban communities prevented Black women from actually being able to exercise their right to vote. This is also still considered part of the first wave of the feminism movement. Now, I'll move myself over here again. In 1924, the Society for Human Rights was founded by Henry Gerber in Chicago, and this was actually the first documented gay rights organization that we've seen in our country's history. A few years after this, in 1944, was the rape of Ressie Taylor. She was a 24-year-old Black mother and sharecropper. This ignited the first wave of the civil rights movement. Her rape occurred 11 years before Emmett Till's murder, and NAACP activist Rosa Parks actually led the investigation and garnered extensive coverage in the Black press for her rape. She was one of the first women to speak up. Now, in 1948, President Truman integrated the armed forces. In 1954, we see Brown versus Board of Education declaring that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional. And then when we get to 1955, a year later, Claudette Cloven, a retired nurse aide, was arrested at the age of 15 in Montgomery, Alabama, for refusing to give up her seat to a white woman on a crowded, segregated bus. Now, I know this story sounds very familiar. Many people accredit Rosa Parks for being the first to do this. However, it was actually Claudette who did this 9 months before Rosa Parks. She also participated in one of the first acts of the civil rights movement. During that same year in 1955, the Daughters of Belize, or DOB, was founded in San Francisco. This was the first lesbian civil and political rights organization in the United States. A year after that, the Supreme Court declared bus segregation unconstitutional. And then in 1961, Illinois became the first state to actually decriminalize homosexuality by repealing their sodomy laws. Looking at 1963, we see the Civil Rights March on Washington, which was actually organized by Bayard Rustin, a gay Black man who worked very closely with Dr. King during the Civil Rights Movement. Oftentimes, he is not included in our history textbooks or mentioned during Black History Month alongside Dr. King. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act was passed to prohibit wage discrimination based on sex. This again was the second wave of feminism. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, prohibiting discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin. And then a year later, in 1965, women of color were finally granted the right to vote through the Voting Rights Act. This was 95 years after Black men and 45 years after white women. This is also considered part of the second wave of feminism. Now, in 1966, Ernestine Eckstein became the first Black woman to be on the iconic lesbian magazine, The Ladder, which was published by the Sisters of Belize. This is the actual cover of that magazine. This is one of the only photos that you could actually find of her as well. I scoured the internet looking, trust me. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed, prohibiting housing segregation against all minorities. This wasn't just inclusive of Black and Brown individuals, but also for women and those who belong to the LGBTQ community. During that same year, Shirley Chisholm became the first African American woman in Congress. However, a year later, in 1969, the police raid on the Stonewall Inn in New York City happened. This sparked a riot among bar patrons and neighborhood residents, leading to a 6-day protest and violent clashing with law enforcement outside of the bar on Christopher Street in New York City. This raid served as a catalyst for the for the gay rights movement. And this is just a very beautiful illustration that I found that displays Marsha P. Henson at the forefront of this fight. Now, a year after this raid in 1970, actually marked the first year that gay pride liberation was celebrated. This was the first pride, and it was a commencement of that 1-year anniversary of Stonewall. During this same year of 1970, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera founded the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR for short, dedicated to helping street gay people, the street homeless people, and anybody that needed help at that time. Star provided food, clothing, and shelter for countless homeless trans youth, and eventually had chapters in Chicago, California, and even in England. This is Marsha. She looks so happy. We're going to skip through this particular poem, but I can come back to it at the end if we'd like. Now, in 1972, we see Shirley Chisholm once again. She becomes the first woman and the first African American to seek the nomination for President of the United States of America from one of the two major political parties. So oftentimes she's referred as the first woman, but she's actually also the first Black person to run for president in the United States. Love that. A year after this, in 1973, Roe versus Wade was a landmark decision that ruled women had the right to choose to have an abortion. Unfortunately, this was later overturned last year in 2022. This was considered part of the second wave of feminism. In 1973, during that same year, the National Black Feminist Organization was founded to address intersectionality of racism and sexism on Black women. This was also part of the second wave of feminism. And then fast forward just a few years after this, in 1989, the term intersectionality was actually coined by theorist Kimberly Crenshaw. This was the first time that anybody had actually combined the oppressions that can be experienced by multiple different identity levels, intersecting at race, gender, body type, ability type, nationality, all of these intersectionalities that we experience. This was considered part of the third wave of feminism. When we look at the beginning of the 90s, in 1991, Annette Hill testified against Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas for sexual harassment, becoming one of the first modern-day Black women to fight against rape culture, a term that was coined in the 1970s during the second wave of feminism. Her testimony opened doors for future Black survivors of sexual assault and harassment. A year after this, in 1992, was coined the Year of the Woman due to an unprecedented number of women elected to Congress. However, it's very unfortunate that during that same year of 1992, it was seen as one of the worst years on record for anti-LGBTQ violence, according to the New York Anti-Violence Project. This included the death of Marsha P. Johnson, whose body was found in the Hudson River on July 6, 1992. Then we're going to fast forward a little bit through time to 2006. This marks the Me Too movement, which was founded by Tarana Burke. This marks the first inclusive conversation around rape culture, a culture designed to blame victims of sexual assault and normalize sexual violence. 3 years after that, in 2009, the Hate Crimes Prevention Act was signed by President Barack Obama to allow for federal investigation of bias-motivated crimes based on gender identity in cases where local law enforcement was unwilling to act. And then in 2013, the Black Lives Matter movement was founded by Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi after the murder of Trayvon Martin. This was in response to the epidemic of police violence and brutality against Black Americans. And then in 2017, we see the Me Too movement actually see a bigger take off and even played a huge role in the Women's Rights March on Washington, which was the first intersectional feminist activism in which Black, white, and queer movements came together for the first time in our nation's history. In 2020, Say Her Name started to trend after the unjust murder of Breonna Taylor in her own home. During that same year, Black Trans Lives Matter started to also trend after the murder of George Floyd to spread awareness and push inclusion of the Black Lives Matter movement. Looking forward a little bit even further, in 2021, Kamala Harris became the first female, Black, and Asian American to hold national office as the VP of the United States of America. During that same year, the 1619 Project was a landmark project created in 2019 by Nicole Hannah-Jones, a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter covering racial injustice for the I can know why I can't say this word. The New York Times magazine, which later expanded into a book reframing American history to be inclusive of Black Americans and their contributions. And then a year after this, last year, in 2022, Ketanji B. Jackson became the first Black woman nominated for a seat on the United States Supreme Court. That is Black girl magic right there. Black history is not just our past, as history is considered to be consistent and never ending. Black history is now. I am Black history. These last few slides are of Black queer revolutionaries from the past 3 decades, pretty much my entire lifetime. And I thought it would be important to really showcase these individuals because they are part of Black history, the history that is being made now and that we will talk about in the future. The first I want to showcase is a self-described Black lesbian mother, warrior, and poet, Audre Lorde. She's most famous for her passionate writings on Black lesbian feminism and racial issues. Next is Jasmine Stanley, a self-identifying fat queer femme yoga instructor and author who often addresses fat phobia and has revolutionized the wellness and yoga industry to be more inclusive of all body types. Currently, she has 2 books out. One is Every Yoga is for Everybody, and Yoga, My Yoga of Self-Acceptance. Janelle Monáe, a pop culture icon who is very well known for advocating for gay and lesbian rights within the pop culture and within our history and current history. Grace Jones. Grace Jones is an 80s pop culture model, singer, songwriter, producer, and actress, best known for her androgynous appearance and fierce confidence. So beautiful. Someone who's oftentimes not referenced as a part of the community until recently is Whitney Houston, which we see standing to the right of her then girlfriend, Robin Crawford. Robin actually released a book about a year ago talking about her romantic and sexual relationship with Whitney Houston and really explored how she wasn't able to live the life that she wanted to while she was alive. RuPaul, known as one of the most famous drag queens in the United States, most popular for her reality competition series, RuPaul Drag Show. I love that show. And she looks fierce in both photos here. Lena Waithe, an openly lesbian actress, producer, and screenwriter, most known for her coming out episode on the Netflix series Master of None, and also the creator of the Showtime series The Shy. She's an icon. Wanda Sykes, a well-known and openly lesbian comedian, actress, writer, and voice artist. She's been around for a long time, and I hope that she stays because I absolutely love Wanda Sykes. Love is definitely the answer. Willie Ninja. He's best well known as the grandfather of Vogue, voguing. Sam J, who is an openly lesbian comedian and writer, also well known for her writing on Saturday Night Live, as well as her current late night talk show on HBO, which is called Pause, which explores cultural issues specific to the Black and queer experience. If you haven't been able to watch any of these episodes of hers, I definitely encourage you to, if you can, get a HBO subscription or just look up some of the episodes on YouTube. Laverne Cox is an openly transgender actress and LGBTQ advocate, best known for her role in Orange is the New Black. These next few slides are just a few individuals who are currently shifting culture and influence our country's future. We like to say, I am my ancestors' wildest dreams. And if my ancestors could live during this time frame, they would be remiss and amazed at all of our accomplishments. I had to put the Dermalage. They are a fictional elite group of all-female warriors who serve as a special forces unit in the fictitious country of Wakanda. However, the Dermalage were actually based on the real-life warriors of the Agoji. Viola Davis and The Woman King, which is a historical action film based on the same all-female warrior unit, the Agoje, who protected the West African kingdom of Dahomey. Michaela Cole, best known for her leading role in the HBO series I May Destroy You, which tackles the interpersonal and psychological rippling effects of date rape and sexual assault. She's also in the new Black Panther movie. Ava DuVernay was the first African American woman to win Best Actor at the Sundance Film Festival and is most notably known for her films, documentaries, and TV shows which explore the experiences of African Americans during the Jim Crow era, the Civil Rights Movement, as well as racial inequities of mass incarceration and the history of hip hop music. Issa Rae, who is a trailblazing American writer, actress, producer, and comedian, most known for her YouTube web series Awkward Black Girl, which later became the pop culture TV sensation Insecure on HBO. HBO winning, y'all. Marcia Martin, best known for her role as Diane Johnson on the ABC sitcom Blackish. She actually became the youngest person ever to produce a studio film, Little. If you haven't seen it already, definitely go watch it. It stars Issa Rae as well. I had to put Lizzo in here, a 3 Grammy awarded winning singer, rapper, and flutist, and has been a huge champion and advocate of body positivity and body inclusivity by only recruiting plus size dancers for her show. She notably increased the representation of plus size dancers through her Watch Out for the Big Girls reality show competition, which is actually on Amazon Prime, and you can watch it today. Talk about intersectionality. Last, and certainly not least, we have Amanda Gorman, who is the youngest inaugural poet in US history, in spite of her being diagnosed with an auditory processing disorder, which actually makes it difficult for her to pronounce certain words and sounds. Now, Black history is not all about who was the first. It's also about those who have influenced, inspired, instilled hope, and shifted culture. Black resistance isn't only about our pain and struggles to combat oppression. It is also our resiliency and ability to transmute trauma into victorious beauty. This generation of future leaders have taken their legacy and transformed the concept of Black resistance into Black joy, shifting from our collective pain to our collective healing. In 2015, New York writer Cleaver Cruz stated that BlackJoy started the BlackJoy Project, which was a digital and real life movement to center Black joy as an act of resistance. In a conversation with British Vogue, she stated, amplifying Black joy is not about dismissing or creating alternative Black narratives that ignore the realities of our collective pain. Rather, it is about holding the pain and injustices we experience as Black folks around the world in tension with the joy we experience in pain's mist. It's about using that joy as an entry into understanding the oppressive forces we navigate as a means to imagine and create a world that is free of them. This multi-reality movement has since transformed into the hashtag BlackJoy on all major social media platforms. By reconnecting to the things that bring us joy, we can naturally resist oppression.